Great, we're going to reconvene our meeting and welcome Rebecca Washburn, the Director of Lands Administration at Forest Parks and Recreation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name for the record is Rebecca Washburn. I'm the Director of Lands Administration and Recreation with the Forest Parks and Recreation Department. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to have the opportunity to join my esteemed colleagues and share with you a topic that I am very passionate about and love the opportunity to share and raise awareness and help with learning around. So we were very intentional in thinking about having Mr. Austin share the range of programs that our agency has created and developed to respond to private landowners, businesses, lots of different landowners and land uses happening across the landscape because people live in Vermont, animals, plants reside here in Vermont too. And in order for us to be successful in our goal of protecting the natural resources in a place where people live is being adaptive and coming up with strategies that help advance those goals where people and businesses and landowners and land uses are taking place. So the goal was really intentional to describe the range of ways that we try to sneak land protection and natural resource protection into the nooks and crannies of everything that we do. My focus today is really going to be on permanent land protection, the nuts and bolts related to permanent land protection, how our agency carries out this goal on behalf of Vermonters, and lastly, provide some examples and then move into a little bit of what it takes for us to meet these resulting stewardship obligations. So I'll take a couple of slides to walk through permanent land protection and then pause a little bit for questions in case there are any. Hopefully there are. And I have to figure out how to use John's computer. Success factors. I feel like it would be remiss not to talk about what it takes to put together a recipe of success for permanent land protection. And the first and probably the most critical is the willing landowner. There's an anecdote or a fun story that gets passed along to new land protection staff that it takes so many cups of coffee to get a willing landowner to the table. You sit at the table, you have that cup of coffee over and over and over again. And I have a couple of examples of projects that took a lot of cups of coffee to get to fruition. So willing landowners, really a critical component of a success for permanent land conservation. Conservation organizations, arguably pretty important, very critical as well. A conservation organization that can stand up to the test of time, they need to have the expertise to be able to do this complex work. They need to have the capacity. They have to be able to both handle land protection project opportunities and the stewardship obligations that come from that, and all of the other wraparound services that come with being a conservation organization. And they have to have the governance and structure to be enduring and to last and stand the test of time, because permanent conservation, permanence is a pretty long time. We're still trying to figure out how long that is. I think strategic conservation planning is obviously something that you're spending a lot of time hearing about and learning about as a committee. And this too is especially critical when you consider that not all lands are equal. Not all parcels are of equal value, whether that's ecological value or real estate value, and the location, size, and other characteristics that make up a particular parcel really matter. And I think Mr. Austin pointed out earlier when he was referencing the Vermont Conservation Design work that the Fish and Wildlife Department has created is just how useful a planning tool like this is, in complement, I think, complemented by the work that VHCB is doing with the Strategic Conservation Initiative that they've launched and that we're participating in. So I think strategic conservation planning, conservation organizations have these tools. They're really important when you think about not every parcel of land being equal. We want to do strategic conservation. We want to invest these dollars in the right places at the right time in order to achieve the goal of that ecologically functional and connected landscape. Funding, obviously, another one. You won't be surprised to hear that flexible, reliable, accessible, and plentiful funding is really the key to success. That's how funding is effective in allowing land protection to move forward. We need money available to be flexible, to be dedicated to different types of land conservation, to different purposes, whether it's our clean water goals or it's Bicknell's thrush habitat. Having the flexibility to apply funding for land protection and having that accessible when that landowner has had that cup of coffee that it took to get to the stage of being ready to consider a permanent land protection project. And then, of course, my particular favorite, stewardship, is another one that I think is on the minds of most conservation organizations that have been around for a few decades, which many of them have across the country, and ours here in Vermont are no exception. The more success we've had over the decades, the more boards, staff, and anybody thinking about what it means to really achieve conservation permanence are up at night thinking about stewardship and what it takes to uphold this permanent obligation to care for this land, and to those provisions that we put in those conservation easements or took on when we accepted funding to protect land for a particular purpose. We have to deliver on that, and to deliver on that takes expertise and time and money. And we conserved a lot of land and were incredibly successful. We, the conservation community at large, have been really successful in this space, and more organizations are really turning their attention to what it means to then pivot to continuing to be very strategic in that conservation work, but also building up and being prepared with programs that can take on that stewardship work, whether that's active management or really just being the partner to the landowner, the private landowner that's carrying out that permanent land protection. I thought it would be fun to consider the fact that when we talk about permanent land protection, we aren't just talking about one option. There are multiple options. And here's sort of a juxtaposition of the two most common that I think for the purposes of this committee's consideration are really helpful to think about. Fee acquisition. I have heard in listening to testimony that you've already received that there are questions around what does fee acquisition actually mean? What is a conservation easement? So I thought it would be helpful just to show this slide and maybe walk through some of the parallels around what it means to pursue fee acquisition versus conservation easements. And my favorite is to think about the rights associated with owning land as a bundle of sticks. This is a very common way to refer to what it means to consider conservation. Owning land in fee, any of you that own your land, where your house is, where you live, you have acquired more than likely the full bundle of sticks associated with that parcel of land. A conservation easement was a tool created to allow certain entities to acquire certain sticks like public access and development. Those are very common ones that we hold dear here at the Agency of Natural Resources. Another difference I think that comes into play and helps conservation organizations determine which path to potentially take is that fee acquisition. Often this is the full fair market appraised value of a parcel. It's the highest value for that parcel of land. A conservation easement is actually the difference, the delta between the land being appraised before those provisions and conditions are put on the property and the value after those sticks will be acquired by another entity. So that value, presumably for the same parcel, would be less than the full fair market value. So in theory, pursuing conservation easements where appropriate allows our dollars to go a little bit further while still achieving the conservation goals that we're seeking to protect in the long term. Fee acquisition, again, for any of you that own land would know, you have most of, if not all of the management authority and responsibility. I share some of that authority with my husband, but you know what I mean. Full management authority and responsibility around fee acquisition. With conservation easements, management authority and responsibilities is more commensurate with the sticks that you've acquired. You may have some responsibilities toward ensuring public access and working with that private landowner to make sure that public access is happening in the right way. Similarly, certain types of development might be allowable on a property where conservation exists. The Forest Legacy program that Mr. Austin referenced is a great example where we encourage and provide for the opportunity for structures and other developments to support the working forest and the particular types of timber products that might be coming from that parcel of land that's protected with a conservation easement. And then again, going back to what I referred to as one of my favorite topics, are those responsibilities that go on forever. Ownership responsibilities, presuming that you're going to hold on to that land for your life, those are your ownership responsibilities. They look like what I will talk about in a few minutes with what our agency's responsibilities are for management on behalf of the public for the lands that we own. Conservation easements, there are stewardship obligations. Just because you don't own the land in fee doesn't mean that you do that conservation project and you walk away and you march to that next willing landowner, you have that cup of coffee and you keep on going. There are stewardship obligations that come along with conservation easement work. And as I was mentioning earlier, lots of conservation organizations are thinking through what it means to be prepared to carry out this perpetual obligation around stewardship. And I just wanted to point out in sort of contrasting these two options, it's helpful to think through that on a case-by-case basis, a parcel is going to help inform with other factors whether or not should we acquire this land in fee or should we acquire a conservation easement. It's really about the different elements of a conservation project when put together that helps determine whether or not pursuing fee acquisition versus easements is the right step. And every conservation organization will go through this. Some landowners have more flexibility and more interest, others do not. So it often comes up for conservation organizations, and us at the agency are no exception. This is something that we work through pretty regularly, and I'll be happy to go through that when I talk a little bit more about how the agency does this in particular, but this is the point at which I wanted to make sure and pause to see if folks had any sort of nuts and bolts questions around conservation.
First, we have Representative Stebbins and then Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So fee acquisition to me just sounds like buying it, like versus conservation easement. Like, can't you just say buying it? Like, is there anything? That's essentially just what it is. You're buying it outright.
Sometimes you're not buying it. Sometimes there's a landowner that's willing to donate it to you. So you could say acquire. That's a really fancy version of what you're describing. Fee title is a legal term that references buying that full or acquiring that full bundle of sticks. So a willing landowner is going to come to the table with an idea of what they need in order for this conservation project to meet the variety of goals that they have in mind. They might want to preserve the property for future generations and are very interested in making sure that it's open to the public. Some are really looking for a tax deduction, and that's where the potential for donation or bargain sale would come in, where they're selling it for less than that full fair market value. So it does seem sometimes like we could just use really simple words in the goal of being really specific about the complexity of what it means when we talk about fee acquisition. That's why I use the more techie term. I apologize for that.
No, it's just helpful to know it's, yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do you find it difficult for the landowners to come to the table? Do you seek landowners, or do they come to you? I mean,
That's a fabulous question.
I mean, and if so, I mean, why would it be difficult? Did you dealt with?
I think it's a fantastic question. It's so relevant to this conversation and to, I think, really the goals and the success of the impetus behind H126. And I think what Vermont Conservation Design does is help us understand where different parts of the landscape are particularly important when it comes to maintaining or protecting ecological function and connectivity across the landscape. And at the same time, my email in particular and my voicemail box are full of people that are interested in, hey, I own land next to such and such a state forest, or my uncle has a camp on such and such a lake. And there are a lot of landowners that are interested in permanent land protection, like I said, for a variety of purposes, whether it's the tax benefits that might come from it, or the interest in really carrying on a legacy that came from being part of Vermont and growing up in Vermont potentially. But not every parcel is the same as far as that willing landowner. We have a gentleman, he calls a couple of times a year and he's so interested in public land ownership. And his land is so not the right mix of things for our particular agency to own. And we try really hard to help redirect him to other resources and other organizations that might align really well, but he has this idea in his head that he wants this to be publicly owned. And if we're going to use the finite resources and the staff that we have and be able to back up, this is why we do conservation, this is why we own land, we have to say no to some projects, and we have to seek out and be really thoughtful about going to that kitchen table and having that cup of coffee with someone who might not be quite ready yet, or they're ready, but their 13 brothers and sisters aren't quite ready yet.
Right.
So that's a great question. And I can keep coming back to that if more of those kinds of questions percolate, because I think it's a really important one.
Representative Torrey.
This is just a quick follow-up question about the sorts of calls you get. Are you starting to hear from landowners who want to know about other forms of value for maintaining forest cover? Like, because we're learning about these carbon benefits.
Sure.
Like, are you getting calls like that?
Mm-hmm. One of the programs that, as I get a little bit further into the narrative here, the Forest Legacy Program is one of the places where we've been the most successful in what I would consider pretty large landscape conservation. And some of those landowners are really well suited to be able to enroll in carbon markets and have begun doing so. They've worked with partners like TNC or the Vermont Land Trust and are exploring opportunities. We have a couple of landowners that have actually successfully enrolled in carbon markets. So you're absolutely right. Those are questions that are coming up and expertise that we're working to build as we partner with the Forest Service to advance this program to the best of our ability. It's a great question.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. Thank you. You find a lot of landowners coming to you saying, I'm being taxed out of my property. Is there a way I can avoid paying as high a taxes? I went into current use with the property I have.
Mm-hmm.
Save a little bit of money, not a lot, but I save some.
I haven't had that personal experience. It's certainly part of the narrative that we work to try and help as conservationists to think about what is the right composition of conservation options for a particular landowner that is motivated, by pressures on taxes and family members that might have different ideas and goals. So yes, it is part of every conservationist's dialogue with a landowner that's considering it, but it's not one that I've particularly experienced.
Have you had the conversation with right now in current use? It's every 10 years you redo your plan. If you went into a 20 or 25-year management plan, that would preserve property for a longer length of time, wouldn't it?
That's an interesting
Or conserve.
an interesting thought. I actually had to look up my forest management plan because I feel like I'm getting pretty close to 10 years. So I share that same, where am I in this cycle of needing to update my management plan? This isn't my area of expertise. Where my cross-section shows up is through the Forest Legacy Program, again, where we work really closely with our county foresters to help make sure landowners are advancing the goals of the conservation easement they hold or we hold on their property in concert with the provisions of the use value appraisal program. And my sense is, though this is very much anecdotal and Keith would have to back this up, is that the pace of change around management decisions that are being made on a lot of properties happens or occurs more quickly than a 20 to 25 year time horizon. But again, that's very much something that Mr. Thompson would be better to speak to than I would.
Representative Sibilia.
What would some goals of a conservation easement? I think that's what you just said. What would be some goals of a conservation easement?
That's a great question. And it saves you from having to actually look at one, which is really not a pleasant experience if you don't spend a lot of time in them. A conservation easement, I would say a lot of the provisions, particularly the ones that the agency believes to be sort of our baseline in advancing our mission, is public access. And that's not necessarily trails. That's somebody wants to park their car and go for a bird hunt. They're going out early in the morning. They want to go turkey hunting. They're going fishing. So public access, or they want to hike to a trailless peak on a particular property. Public access, dispersed public access is a baseline right that we make sure every conservation easement, with very discrete exceptions, mostly thinking about DEC, environmental conservation's river corridor work. But for the most part, our conservation easements include public access. In some instances, we're actually even taking on some of the management responsibilities with trail-based recreation. So we might align with a recreation partner, many of whom are represented by the Trails and Greenways Council that we work really closely with. And we might take on some shared responsibilities around, this is a really important connection. Kingdom Heritage Lands, Representative Smith is one that I think of a lot around what it means to have conservation easements allow private ownership to continue, but to provide for those trail connections and not put the onus on the private landowner to have to know how to manage trails or work with the local trails group to be able to manage those. Development, again, is another one that I mentioned. Residential development being the most common. Conservation easement might restrict, say there's only one residence that can be developed here, or the right to subdivide only one time or two times, really in the interest of either concentrating that residential development in certain areas away from sensitive or significant natural communities, or just simply trying to reduce it on the landscape if the conservation goals are really about protecting, say, a large amount of forest.
Great.
So great questions. And I can follow up with even more sort of better bulleted list of the types of provisions that conservation easements allow, if you'd like that as follow-up too.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right, I'm going to jump into, so agency ownership and management. One of the fun things in putting this slide together was actually looking back at our records to see when the first acquisition took place to establish a state forest. And it was in 1909, and it was in the town of Plainfield. L.R. Jones State Forest happens to be our oldest ownership. And now, you know, many, many, many years later, I'm not a mathematician, so I'm not even going to try to count how many years it's been. We have about 360,000 acres. And again, this is across the agency. This shows up as state forests and state parks, wildlife management areas, boating access areas, or natural areas the Forest Parks and Recreation Department holds. So lots of different interests. As you've, I'm sure, heard from many who've provided testimony from the Agency of Natural Resources, we own and protect land for a lot of different purposes on behalf of the public, and sharing that responsibility across the agency through those different departments is how we achieve that goal. And then again, as I mentioned, mostly talking about the Forest Legacy Program and Secretary Moore's earlier references to Act 250, we hold about 140,000 acres in conservation easements. I catch up with my notes here, make sure I don't miss anything. So for the agency to be able to carry out this work, and I think this is something that is underlying in the questions that you ask, and certainly something that we want to be able to convey, is just how important the ability to show up and do this work really well, what that means to the agency. And we have professional staff that are committed to working with private landowners and funders and partners to develop these projects. This is part of our bread and butter, and any conservation organization's secrets to success are really in the staff that are trained and have the experience to be able to do this. On top of that, we work with our district stewardship teams. Again, maybe a new term for all of you, but really what it means is we have a suite of professionals across different disciplines, whether that's wildlife, recreation, amphibians, the whole range of foresters, the whole range of different natural resource considerations that we're managing for, come together and review and evaluate those phone calls that I was mentioning to you that we get quite a bit. The ones that really do make sense to evaluate, to bring those to the district stewardship teams. Our staff are having conversations to say, is this the right type of parcel for state ownership? What does it mean to consider this 100 acres, this 500 acres? Should we own this? Should we conserve it with a conservation easement? Should we actually suggest that they work with Vermont Land Trust or one of our other conservation partners? And the criteria they're using are the ecological values present on the property, what we know about those, public access values, management values, which from my standpoint mean, is this going to address an existing stewardship challenge we might have? Does it provide better public access? Does it provide better forest management access? Does it get rid of a pesky boundary that we've had a really difficult time managing in a neighborhood? What does it look like to consider the management benefits of acquiring this piece of land? And then, of course, funding is one that is particularly acute for us when we think about being able to pivot and move really quickly when that 20th cup of coffee comes around and that conservation or that landowner says, all right, I'm ready. Can we do this in 6 months? Having funding available to us is more difficult for our agency. And that's where our partners come into play. I have a project that I'm going to profile where if it weren't for our partners, we would not have been able to take advantage of what I would consider one of the most recent and amazing additions to our portfolio of lands that we hold on behalf of the public. So we do a lot of thinking when it comes to, should this be publicly owned or should it not? And how should it be publicly owned? Is this a conservation easement? Is this land that we owned? And I'm proud to say that after all of our technicians and our practitioners and our scientists spend time thinking about this, we involve the commissioners, we involve the agency secretary, the governor, the municipality. There are so many others that play a role in making sure that we've got all of the ingredients right to get to a project that ends up in state ownership or that we somehow have a permanent responsibility associated with. So a lot of thought goes into this work. This is the project that I wanted to profile that I would say the range of staff that worked on this particular project over 15 years to finally acquire this piece of land. It was probably more than 20 cups of coffee. This is 164 acres, which in another part of the state might just be like, 164 acres, but of lakeshore, adjacent to a state park that is as popular as ALBURGH BLUFFS. This was amazing. 16 natural communities hosted on this 164 acre property. That's also an incredible statistic with 25 rare endangered species present there. This was a project, as I said, we sat through lots of conversations with this landowner to really be present and to be at the table when that person was ready. All right, I'm ready, let's go. And luckily for us, we had a partner like the Nature Conservancy and the Housing and Conservation Board to help make sure that now that landowner was ready to go, that we were ready to receive, and we were not going to miss this, having had to build and build and build over so many years to get to this point. And then, as I mentioned, the district stewardship teams played an important role in figuring out, okay, we finally have this opportunity. What do we do with it? Is it a wildlife management area because of all these amazing natural communities and RT&E species? Or should it be a state park because it's adjacent to the existing ALBURGH Dune State Park? And the decision was made. FPR ownership is the right key here because we can put protections in place that help secure the conservation values that are present in those natural communities and those rare and threatened species, while also providing this amazing public access opportunity that this property presents. So great example of, right time, right place, lots of patience, and a relatively small acreage with a really, really enormous impact. And then flip that on its head. Here's the Champion Lands up in the Northeast Kingdom, 132,000 acres. I was just starting my first stint with the department when this project was coming about. So I don't have firsthand knowledge and experience about how many cups of coffee this took with how many different individuals. But I will say, you can see from the map here that just shows a portion of the lands that were protected with this project, that the conservation values of working forest, ecological protections, and public access really drove multiple ownership outcomes. If we wanted to achieve this conservation outcome on such a huge scale in the Northeast Kingdom, we needed to think about where do private landowners fit into this? Where does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service fit in? And how does the state help complement the different types of ownership here? Because we're thinking about public access, we're thinking about contributions to the forest economy in this part of the state. So I thought this was a good juxtaposition to the ALBURGH BLUFFS project to be able to describe for you what I think is, again, another example of where conservation values drove the way the land ownership or the conservation tools that were used to achieve this outcome. And partnerships were critical. And again, Mr. Austin will tell you, we meet annually with a room full of amazing partners that are thinking through, okay, we have a timber sale going on in this place. We need to close this fast trail. We have to reopen it over in this other place to make sure the connectivity is maintained. There's a lot of coordination that goes on to make sure that the conservation values are upheld on an annual basis forever, which is crazy. Oh, this one's yours, John.
So we're almost near the end, and I'm mindful of your time. Wanted to just give you a quick illustration of how the agency also makes investments in permanent land conservation with the agricultural community. So we've been using these numbers, I apologize, are slightly dated, but still relevant. We've been putting millions of dollars for the past 4 or 5 years from the US EPA coming through the Lake Champlain Basin program and our sister Department of Environmental Conservation to acquire interests in retired farmland in the Lake Champlain Basin. So we have strategic focus areas along Otter Creek, the Siskiyou River, the Winooski River, some other areas where we have been working with willing and interested, mostly farm landowners who are looking at retiring some of their farmland, and the land itself is within the floodplain and well suited for wetland restoration. So we refer to this as our Wetland Conservation and Restoration Initiative. It's federally funded. Not a penny of state money has to go to support this work. We have staff who work with these willing landowners, again, willing communities, to acquire these properties. And we put together a wetland restoration plan. We restore the wetlands, and then they remain in public ownership. So as an example, we've been making for some time now significant investments in land conservation and wetland restoration along Otter Creek between Brandon Swamp and Cornwall Swamp. The strategic objective there being ultimately to have a complete network of conserved lands and restored floodplains within that large stretch of Otter Creek for all kinds of benefits, as you can imagine, including flood resilience. So as one example, the Lemon Fair River system, Creek would be another great example where we've been expanding conservation ownership there, wetland restoration for all of the same purposes. So just as a complement to what Ms. Washburn was sharing with you, other types of lands that the agency is buying and restoring for various public interests. This is kind of a neat one. So I'll just point out, we're looking at the lower Winooski River where it comes into Lake Champlain. And these areas here are what's called the Fitzgerald Farm. We worked with the Fitzgeralds for a number of years. They were ready to retire from farming, and there was no interest in anyone to buy the farm. There was no children who were interested in taking it over. And it is smack in the middle of floodplain on the lower Winooski River. It floods every single spring and many falls, and we have a lot of precipitation in the fall. And by the way, if you want a great place to go birding in the spring, like in April, this is one of them. When it floods, it has an amazing array of birds that show up there during spring migration. You're apt to see just about anyone. Sandhill cranes, you name it. In any event, we now own it. In addition, we've expanded since then. We've purchased the Senesac farm, which is adjacent to it. One of the neat, unique things about this one is its proximity to the urban centers of Winooski, Colchester, and Burlington. So we've had a land ownership footprint in the Intervale and the lower Winooski River for many years. The Intervale Wildlife Management Area. There's also some other wildlife management area properties on the mouth of the Winooski River. This expansion of the public ownership here provides some more unique opportunities for these communities to connect with nature. So one of the outcomes of this, beyond the ecological benefits of restoring these wetlands and permanently protecting them, is they'll also be available for school groups or citizens in these communities to go and just enjoy connecting with the land. So that just seemed like an interesting complement to what Ms. Washburn shared.
Austin?
Rounding out, wrapping up here for you. Let me just get to, so again, I think one of the consistent themes throughout what we've been talking about is this idea of permanence and the responsibilities we take on when it comes with permanence. And I wanted to share an excerpt from an agreement that's in place here in our agency. Came about in about 1983, where we took the position that it would be in the interest of the public and the interest of our shared goals around protecting natural resources and providing for public access, that we consider an agency lands approach to land management, this interdisciplinary approach to planning and decision making. And it's something that I think you'll hear from us that we're all very proud of. We're known across the country for really effectively putting together a system in which, for those lands that we own and manage and have responsibilities for, we're doing the best job we can to make decisions that consider the breadth of different natural resource considerations. So just because it's a state forest or a state park doesn't mean that we don't have colleagues like Mr. Austin helping inform how do we make decisions in those state forests and state parks that are benefited by our wildlife biologists, our fisheries biologists, and others helping us design public access, designing timber sales and other activities in those places. And similarly, our colleagues are helping Fish and Wildlife and DEC think about what it means to provide public access in a way that is sustainable and built and designed to maintain to the highest standard. So we take this structure and this approach to land management really seriously. And again, feel like what it does is provide us with the credibility to be thinking about that broad landscape consideration of 360,000 acres across the landscape and what it means to make sure that those lands are doing the best job they can to provide those connections to nature for kids and grandkids, but also seeking to achieve that goal of an ecologically functional and connected landscape. And I think just to get into the weeds really quickly on what this framework really looks like when you're living in it and when you're a recreation organization and you're reaching out to us and you want to know how do we do land management, you're looking at a system that starts with our leadership team, which Secretary Moore leads, and is really there to help make decisions and take action based on where our cross section is across the different departments' missions and goals. We have an agency land stewardship team that I chair that Mr. Austin is a member of, that helps set policy and process and guide how to inform work like our riparian guidelines and other guidelines and policies that help us do our work the best way we can. And then again, mentioning those district stewardship teams, we have teams across the state. We have 5 of them that know these lands really well, that maintain and manage public access and the whole range of services that public lands provide. They know these lands really well. Some, like the Northeast Kingdom, have huge swaths of acres and roads and trails that they're managing. Others down in the southern part of the state might have smaller units of land, but they have dozens and dozens of them. So they're managing lots of neighbors, and sometimes neighbors are harder than managing miles and miles of boundary line. So it's just really interesting when you get into the weeds and you think about what it means to own land across such a big landscape, at the Vermont scale, big landscape, and think about how we have these teams in place to make sure that we're doing it to the best of our ability. And then I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, we have this system of staff internally that we're lean, we're nimble, we're gritty, we get this work done, we love what we do, and we have the privilege and benefit of so many different partners that are helping us get this done too. Recreation organizations are there when we need them. When we are talking about putting in new trails or helping educate users about how to use trails responsibly, our recreation organizations are there by our side, helping us with that work. We have friends of groups that are helping with state parks, and I think folks like Trout Unlimited, the Wild Turkey Federation. These are all examples of committed volunteers, in most cases, committed volunteers, some professional staff that are there to help us make sure that we're managing for the broadest range of public benefit that agency lands represent. And then just lastly, I thought it would be helpful. I didn't know that we were going to talk this long, but thinking that you might want just a summary of some key takeaways. I think getting back to this idea that there are so many different land uses and ownership types happening across the landscape that it was incumbent upon us as an agency to develop tools and strategies that meet people and businesses and landowners where they're at. How can we meet them where they're at to make sure that we're advancing the goal of natural resource protections with landowners that aren't ready for, they haven't had that final cup of coffee, they aren't ready for land protection, they aren't ready for a conservation easement, or they may never be ready for a conservation easement. These tools are here to help us move the needle on conservation without having to work on building up staff capacity, bringing in and leveraging the dollars necessary to acquire a land completely in fee or a conservation easement. Permanent land protection is an important tool, but it requires certain success factors. I went through those. I'm happy to answer more questions about them. This is a powerful tool, but it's one we have to wield really carefully because it comes with a perpetual obligation around stewardship, and it takes a lot of time and money to get there. And then not all land is equal. We have VCD, which helps inform where these investments should take place across the landscape so that as we consider a lofty and fun to reference goal like 30 by 30 and think about, it's not just 30% of our landscape that we want to protect. It's 30% of what it means to protect that ecologically functional and connected landscape where people live, and being really discreet about where those lands are that we should be protecting. So those are the key takeaways. I'm happy to answer questions, though I know we probably don't have a lot of time for them.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes. Are all agency lands permanently conserved?
We own land in fee, and we are considered, a landowner such that we own those lands. So by all intents and purposes, that is permanently protected. Conservation easements we hold in perpetuity. I don't think we have any term easements that would expire. I don't know if Act 250 mitigation easements are ever time sensitive. Okay. So yes, in our instance, off the top of my head, our land protection is permanent.
Could you provide us with a definition of the term permanently conserved? It doesn't have to be in this moment. In fact, I'd actually like it in writing.
Okay. I'd be happy to follow up in writing with a definition of that for you. That's a great question.
We'll share it with everyone.
Okay.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. All of the state lands, you had a slide up there of a state park in ALBURGH.
Yeah.
All of the state lands that you have acquired, do you pay these communities? You're probably tax exempt, I would assume.
We pay a payment in lieu of taxes.
Pilot payments to the communities. Oh, good.
Yep. So we track acreage. We track it every year. We anticipate what that acreage is going to be, and then we follow up on which projects actually took place. So we're revising those acreages with municipalities on an annual basis, and then work through the budgeting process to make sure that we have the funds to issue those payments.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Representative Stebbins.
Yes, Madam Chair. So you have 360,000 acres owned, and then 140,000 acres in conservation easement. My question is, mentioned that is for everything like state forests, boating. So that to me, given how much Vermonters and visitors love our state parks and forests and hiking trails, what portion of that would you say is like set aside versus actively used?
I think when you're considering the public, you and me having the ability to walk to any tree in that forest or go to any shoreline, those lands are available for that purpose. There are none where you can't walk there, you can't go there. The land that we own, the conservation easements that we hold, that is one of the core values that I think our agency holds, is that you and I should be able to walk so that, such that we can be able to walk to every corner of every parcel.
So, sorry, clarifying question. I guess my question is, we can love things to death. So, like thinking about boat ramps and what portion of that land would you say is sort of healthy for itself as opposed to like really actively used for recreation?
I don't know if I would do the question justice to try and come up with a proportion. I think what you're getting at is, we have places like the top of Camel's Hump that are incredibly popular. This is a fragile community, but it's a place where hundreds and hundreds of visitors may happen upon on a daily basis to take in the view and to take in a hike. And our job with our colleagues across the agency is to make sure that people like you and I have the ability to go up there and visit that summit and to not do too much damage in doing so. Through our long-range management planning, which we do for the units of land that we own as an agency, we do this work together. We think about what's called a recreation opportunity spectrum, and it thinks about the type of public access that's taking place, the intensity of that public access, the types of uses that might be taking place, and helps us make management decisions that are sort of in line with or aligned with what the public expects from an experience, say, at ALBURGH Dune State Park versus Roxbury State Forest, where there's much less intense use, but certainly no less welcoming opportunity for the public to enjoy. So we do spend a lot of time thinking about exactly what you're describing. Some places are incredibly popular and we manage for that popularity. Some places are much less popular and we manage to maintain that, that experience that the public expects from less visitors being in those. Yeah, thank you. That's just a great question.
Representative Zakowicz.
Thank you. Thank you and John Austin for a really compelling presentation describing the importance of the permanent conservation of land. And at the end here, in your takeaway, you talk about how we should take that and combine it with what we know about Vermont that VCD tells us to guide our policy. And that seems to be what H126 is all about. Earlier, I thought I heard from the secretary that the permanence part was a problem. And so I'm having a hard time reconciling the incredible importance of permanence with why it's so objectionable at the same time. And maybe that's a question for.
Yeah, I didn't intend to leave you with the impression that it's objectionable. My goal was to indicate it can't be the sole tool in our toolbox. And I think very much for the reasons Becca shared about sort of the path to conservation can take a long time, and having options and alternatives that meet landowners where they're at is essential to achieving our overall conservation goals.
Yeah, great.
Yes, go ahead.
Representative Morris.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Representative Sakowicz stole my question or part of it. That's okay. I have a follow-up and maybe trying to acquire a different answer. So simple minds it's been said that simple minds can be simply confused, and that may be where I'm at. So the secretary did mention, and thank you, Representative Sakowicz, that the three categories seemed like a narrow focus, and the concentration was on permanent conservation. And then we heard from Mr. Austin about ski area mitigation included permanent conservation of other lands. And then we're hearing Ms. Washburn talk about permanent land protection is an important tool that requires success factors. And I just wanted, and then reviewing the bill here, a review of the 3 conservation categories defined in section 2801, which is what you alluded to, of this title, and suggestions for modifications or additions to these categories. So I'm wondering if that language expands upon that answer, the question and answer, that that might be a narrow focus, but we're trying to solicit modifications or additions to expand it. And you talked about some wonderful programs that under the conservation design that would be a solution to.
Yeah, I think it's a question of timing, right? And if we're making recommendations for a plan we've already invested energy in constructing, where does that leave us? Are we developing a plan based on our proposed changes to the definitions as they appear in statute, or are we being asked to develop a plan consistent with the definitions that would be added to statute as a result of this bill?
The 3 categories.
Correct.
Okay. Simple person can remain confused.
Thank you for your presentations today.
Thank you for having us.
All right, with that committee, back tomorrow morning at 9.
Yeah.
That's it.